Welcome back to Beyond the Bench, the podcast from Mountain States Legal Foundation, where we explore the cases, people, and principles shaping the fight for liberty in America. Today, we are joined by Travis Joseph, president of the American Forestry Resource Council, former senior legislative aide to an Oregon congressman, a senior policy advisor on the House Natural Resources Committee, and the director of Northwest Policy for the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Travis Joseph, it is great to have you, and thanks for joining us for a conversation. My gosh, you're a busy man.
Mouthful. It's a
That's a
mouthful.
mouthful for sure, but
Yeah.
you're a busy guy.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, so just to kick us off, for those of you who may not know who Travis is, feel free to elaborate more on who you are and what you do and how you got to where you are today.
I feel like I have a unique trajectory, into these issues. I'm not from this industry. I'm not from the forest products industry. I grew up in Eugene, Springfield, Oregon. That really is, as some of your listeners might know, ground zero for the Pacific Northwest Forest Wars. This is, where a lot of the conflict existed on federal lands and the spotted owl and listed species. That's actually not my original background. No one in my family actually even worked for the forest products industry. My exposure to these issues came through politics. In fact, when growing up in Eugene, Springfield, I thought that I wanted to be an environmental attorney. I actually thought that I wanted to, adjudicate these issues in court and be a lawyer myself. But as I progressed through these issues and learned more about these issues, I realized that I wasn't thinking about them correctly. I didn't quite have the right perspective and background. I knew that I wanted to be involved in these issues around public lands and our federal forests and how they're connected to communities and working people, but I wasn't really sure exactly what my role was going to be. So after college, I went to the University of Oregon. I studied liberal arts. I majored in history and international studies. And then I went abroad. I actually backpacked through Central America, and then I moved to London, and I did graduate work in London on these issues, on the relationship between natural resources management, economic development in an international context. How are natural resources managed in Africa and South America and Asia? And through that exposure, sort of that academic, intellectual, theoretical, perspective, I started thinking, I don't know that I got this right. I think that there's a lot more complexity to this than I'm being exposed to at home in Oregon around our federal forest issues and these conflicts. And I had this extraordinary opportunity to moved from London to Washington, D.C., and I started my career working as a policy person. You read it through the intro of, working in Washington, D.C. as a congressional staffer for my hometown representative, Congressman Peter DeFazio, who served in Congress, the longest serving Oregon congressman in history. And I got exposed to these issues. He's a progressive Democrat, was a progressive Democrat. He's retired now. And just through meetings with constituents, which included the forest products industry, so-called environmental groups, we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, county governments, elected officials, business groups, I think I realized that I just had the wrong perspective on federal lands and federal forests, what the real conflicts are, what the real solutions are. And just through curiosity and asking questions, I found that even though I came from frankly, a more liberal upbringing and education, that the forest products industry, the timber industry, was more in line with my values and really how I think about conservation and environmentalism. So through my work on Capitol Hill for 10 years on various committees and for Congressman DeFazio, I found myself really aligning about this really important connection between our forest, our public lands, our rural economies, working people, and what stewardship and active management and conservation really means. And incredibly, after almost 10 years on the Hill, I got a call from the American Forest Resource Council saying, hey, would you be interested in interviewing for this position? I thought that they were interviewing me to, be a staffer for AFRC, and it turned out they were looking for, their next president. I interviewed, and that gave me an opportunity just to speak truth to power here and say, hey, here's how I'm coming at these issues. Here's how I think we're going to have to strategize and think differently about this if we're going to make progress politically on these issues. And they gave me this opportunity to run AFRC, and I've been with this organization for more than 10 years. And what we do, just to maybe anticipate the next question, because a lot of people don't know what AFRC is or what we do, but AFRC is a trade association, and we represent the mills, the manufacturers, the loggers. We even represent rural communities and counties in the western United States, and our focus is active forest management of our federal lands to produce timber supply for the mills that rely on our federal lands to make world-class wood products that every single person in the world uses every single day in their lives.
That's awesome. And it sounds like you have a well-rounded amount of experience, both, nationally, internationally. And I'm actually really curious, just kind of stemming off of that introduction. You've done a lot of work both here, Central America, while backpacking, you've learned a lot. Is there any particular experience or interaction that you had while traveling that kind of influenced what you bring now to the table as a president of AFRC?
Yeah, I think it gives me perspective and context. It was shocking to me, growing up in Oregon. I love our public lands. I've been so blessed to be able to explore our public lands, not just in Oregon, but throughout our country. I love to climb and hike and camp, and like probably most of your listeners, our public lands are one of the greatest heritage of the United States of America. And when I was abroad, it just sort of struck me. The question just kept coming to my mind is like, what are we fighting about in the United States? Like, how these other countries manage their resources or don't manage their resources, and some of the environmental challenges that I experienced and saw firsthand, whether that was in Africa or South America or Central America. And then thinking about so in Oregon, where we grow the tree, we grow the trees the best, we manufacture them into, incredible resources that we need with the cleanest energy in the United States of America. We have the strongest environmental and labor laws on planet Earth in the United States. Like, what is it that we're arguing about here? We all agree that we need wood products, we want healthy forests, we want healthy communities. Based on what I was seeing globally, I mean, if we're thinking about environmentalism, that's a global issue. It's a local issue, but it's a global issue. And it was really, I guess, kind of that aha moment of we should be working together and celebrating a lot of our progress and accomplishments in environmentalism in the Pacific Northwest. What are we fighting about? What is it that is driving this conflict between, again, so-called environmental groups and the timber industry and rural communities and workforces? And I say so-called, environmental groups. You've heard me say that now a couple of times. I think the timber industry are the environmentalists. I think we're the conservationists. That's why I do this job, frankly, is that, the people who have spent their entire lives stewarding our lands, whose jobs are in the woods. Why do we think these people do these jobs? They do these jobs because they love our forests, they love our public lands, they're incredibly skilled at what they do. I think we should celebrate that. And just because you might be against active management of federal forests, or you file a lawsuit, or you don't want to see a tree get cut, that doesn't make you an environmentalist. Environmentalism and conservation is an action. Conservation is an action. And the people that I represent are the people who are taking action to steward and care for our federal lands now and into the future.
So kind of building off that, you brought up the important question of what are we fighting for? What are we arguing about, right? And a lot of these people, like you said, they're taking actions, but they're also facing problems while, coming face to face in these actions. So what is, I guess, for those who aren't too steeped in forest policy and much like myself may not have a big, well-rounded knowledge of forest advocacy and litigation, what is the core problem facing federal forests in the West right now?
There's a couple. On the sort of biological, environmental side, we have a federal forest health and wildfire crisis. They're related, but they're sort of two separate crises. A big part of our federal lands in the western United States, we have, forest mortality. Our forests are dying more than they're growing. And you combine that with these catastrophic wildfire events that are completely nuking our landscapes, which destroys habitat for wildlife, which reduces recreational opportunity and public access, which pollutes our air, which pollutes our water. So those are the issues. There's this old fight, an antiquated fight in the 1990s around loggers and the owl and protecting the environment and working people. I think that is a false, not only just a false argument, but a false construct to what's really going on the landscape. At scale, we have millions of acres of federal land that you and me own collectively. The public, the American public owns these lands. The federal government manages them on our behalf. And we have extraordinary environmental, social, cultural, economic risks on our federal lands that are not being addressed. And we have these constructs, these well-meaning environmental laws to try to conserve these lands. But those are antiquated, systems and approaches to conserve our natural resources on federal lands. And now they're in the way of proactive, science-based, quick action to address these crises. That's one. So forest health, wildfire crises. But the other one that maybe is not being named that I want to call out that really is one of the other biggest issues is we're losing our ability to manage our forest. Why? Because we're losing the infrastructure, we're losing the people, we're losing the supply chains, we're losing the markets that allow us to manage our forests. And once you lose mills in these communities, once you lose the workforce, the know-how, the equipment, the knowledge of how to manage these resources, it's almost impossible to recreate that. It just becomes uneconomical to do. And we're seeing this in the United States. If you look at the southwest part of the United States, just to call out Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California, when you lose the infrastructure and the ability to manage your forests, you don't manage your forests, and the forests manage you. And that's not an outcome that I think any American is supportive of right now, looking at the consequences of these fires and these forest health epidemics.
So I guess talking on the alternative, even when you talked about places where, people are taking action, maybe it's following through, maybe things that might not have been set up for long-term success. You talk a lot of almost like Band-Aid plans. And speaking of those kind of plans, the Northwest Forest Plan, right? It was adopted in the 1990s, and you talked about that era as well. You touched on it. So I guess elaborating for people, so what was it designed to solve, and where do you believe it has fallen short overall?
No, you're going to get me fired up here. This
That's
is
what I'm here for. That's what I'm here for.
No, the Northwest Forest Plan, as some of your listeners, very likely know, is this construct that was created and essentially implemented in the 90s under the Clinton administration to try to resolve this issue between, logging old growth and the trajectory of the northern spotted owl and some salmon populations. So sort of the conflict that we've already been talking about is this idea of stewardship and management in the woods and species and other environmental values. And so when Clinton was actually on the presidential trail, he came out to Portland and he had these meetings and created a summit and said, I'm going to solve this problem. And the consequence of that was this plan, the 1994 Northwest Forest Plan, that zones our national forests in 3 states: Western Washington, Western Oregon, and Northern California. Its footprint is about 24 million acres of national forests. This is just public land, so it doesn't touch private land. And that overarching management regime guides federal forest management and has for 30 years. Everything that you can do on federal land. So if there's a logging project on a national forest within that footprint, it has to be consistent with the Northwest Forest Plan. And that's been on the books for now just a little over 30 years. It didn't resolve those problems. It was supposed to provide predictability to the industry, to mills, to manufacturers, to loggers, to rural communities. Maybe we can talk a little bit down the road here about that connection between rural communities and federal lands and what that means. But essentially the Northwest Forest Plan was intended to say, okay, we've got this conflict, we'll zone our forest. A big part of that driving factor is trying to save the northern spotted owl. There are huge consequences. We, the government, know that. We're going to dramatically reduce timber production on these lands, but the idea is that we have to comply with the Endangered Species Act. How do we help you communities? How do we help you industry? None of that played out. None of that. Just to be really clear about it, the northern spotted owl is not in a good spot now. It continues to be on a very dangerous trajectory towards extinction, frankly. And now we know, and I think we knew then, what was driving that. Competition with the barred owl, and more recently catastrophic wildfires that were destroying the habitat of the northern spotted owl. It wasn't logging. Sure, logging historically had a connection to the trajectory of the owl, but what we really understand are the major driving factors of the risk to the northern spotted owl: barred owl, fire. And the Northwest Forest Plan didn't tackle either one of those issues. Meanwhile, we lost hundreds of mills. We lost tens of thousands of jobs. Rural communities really suffered. And it goes back to this legal relationship between rural county governments and payments from timber sales. And just to quickly capture that, is under federal law for more than 100 years, the federal government has said, look, we manage most of your states in the West here. My home state, the federal government manages 60% of the entire state. We know that you, county governments, can't tax the federal government. We're limiting your ability to grow and develop. So we will link you to the management of these lands, and you'll get a portion of timber receipts to support your essential services like roads, schools, search and rescue, the essential functions of county governments. And for a long time, that worked in the 1900s, right? For many decades, these counties were connected to active management of a federal forest, and they did receive that financial support to build their communities, invest in their communities. And in fact, some of the best schools in Oregon in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were in rural communities because there was a lot of wealth being generated from active management of federal lands. That changed in the 1990s. Timber harvest came down 80 to 90%, which meant that the revenues for county governments dropped 80 to 90%, and it hollowed out these communities. In many cases, they haven't recovered. Congress stepped in the early 2000s and said, whoa, we've created a crisis. We need to make sure that you county governments are taken care of. We're going to write you a check out of the United States Treasury, and we're going to help supplement these lost revenues, lost jobs with a check from the United States Treasury. That's called Secure Rural Schools payments. Other people know a similar program called Payment in Lieu of Taxes. PILT is another program. And that's really the government saying, we understand that our decisions as a federal government impact you, county governments, so here's a payment to make up for that. And over 25 years, those payments have continued to be ratcheted down further and further. And today, that connection between essentially managing our federal lands and county governments has all but been severed. We want to change that. We want to change that. We believe that if you responsibly manage your federal lands, you can generate not only the environmental benefits, but you can also create opportunity for communities and create revenue to support essential government services like we had for, frankly, nearly half of a century.
Right, and especially because you're talking about 30 years of difference, 30 years of litigation, 30 years of different administrations, and when you look at the big picture, there's a lot of different even acts and laws that go into place that stack on top of each other, and we are, like you said, operating in a completely different wildfire and ecological reality, as well as communal reality. So kind of to move the train along, we're talking about now the Oregon and California Railroad and Coos Bay Wagon Road Grant Lands Act. Let's touch a little bit on that. Often called the ONC Act, obviously for obvious reasons, contains a sustained yield timber mandate. So what does that actually require?
Yeah, the ONC lands are some of the most unique forest lands, really public lands in the United States of America. They're checkerboarded. They exist only in Western Oregon, despite the reference to California. They have a super long history that we don't need to cover, in this conversation. But bottom line is it has a very complex legal history that goes back even to the late 1800s. But they're some of the most productive, forest lands on planet Earth. They grow about 1.2 billion board feet of timber per year. To put that into context, 1.2 billion board feet, that's like a column of wood, 1 foot wide, grown from the floor of where you're sitting and where I'm sitting to the surface of the moon. That's how much these lands grow every single year. We're harvesting just a fraction of that. But to get back to your question around the legality of the ONC lands, is why they're so unique legally is that no other lands in the United States of America have a directive that the ONC lands have. And that is, all lands shall be managed for permanent sustained yield forest production. Why that's different than Forest Service lands is because Forest Service lands are multi-use lands. There's lots of different values to manage for. The ONC lands has a directive from Congress using that key word shall. Congress is telling the executive branch, you have to do this. This is a non-discretionary action. No other lands do that on federal lands. And so that is the primary purpose of these ONC lands, is to be managed for timber production, to support county governments and to support the timber infrastructure in Western Oregon. And again, that happened for a really long time until the Northwest Forest Plan. And the Northwest Forest Plan really is the mechanism that changed management, not just on Forest Service lands in the Pacific Northwest, it also changed the trajectory of the ONC lands. And that's the legal argument that we've been wrestling with for a quarter century, since the 90s, really, is what's the meaning of the ONC Act? I feel like I can read words on a piece of paper here, and Congress is pretty clear about saying, this is what you have to do. Go do that. Now, a lot of people have misinterpreted that to mean that if you're doing permanent sustained yield timber production on the ONC lands, that you can't deliver other values. And that's really unfortunate, because to me, if you're doing good stewardship, good management of our federal lands, you will deliver all those other benefits. You will deliver healthier wildlife habitat, clean air, clean water, recreational opportunities, while supporting communities in the workforce. But that's been the fight of the ONC Act, is the question that you just prompted. Does it really mean what it says? And we haven't quite resolved that.
I don't know. That's a great point to bring up as well, because you're bringing up the ability to inherently, I guess, benefit right from these federal receipts, and these forest receipts. But then you have things like the hot topic is always the Antiquities Act. Right? So it gives presidential
It's a hot
authority.
one for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
We could probably spend the whole episode on the Antiquities Act.
Yeah, it's its own can of worms, It's its own can of worms.
And if you're a lawyer, and I think it actually is so relevant to today's conversation, what we're talking about in terms of our republic and our democracy and separations of power, truly, I don't know that there's an issue in natural resources, or certainly not on forestry, that's more relevant to that bigger picture question around who does what in our government. Does Congress make the laws on public lands, or does the President of the United States make the laws on public lands? And that really has been highlighted through this conflict on the ONC Act. Let me explain why. As I shared, there is a non-discretionary mandate on the ONC lands that says, the BLM in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, you have to do this, you shall. And it shall be timber production on all lands. Well, something happened in 2000 that really provoked this question, and that was that, again, to go back to former President Bill Clinton, he used the Antiquities Act to create a national monument on the ONC lands. Well, why does that matter? Because it really created this legal conflict where the former president said, I have the power under the Antiquities Act to create a national monument and override congressional intent. Because here you had Congress saying since 1937, you have to do this, shall. And the president coming in saying, no, I don't. I don't need to do that. I'm going to use this other statute that's older to say, I have the power and discretion to use that authority under the Antiquities Act to override what Congress told me I had to do on these exact same lands. And this is not a new issue, Noah, because actually the former President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked the same question on the same land base. He asked his own attorneys and said, hey, I'm thinking about creating a national monument on these ONC lands. Can I do that legally? And the solicitor said, no, you can't, because the ONC Act says you, the executive branch, have to execute the ONC Act. So no, you can't come in with the Antiquities Act and override Congress. That's a constitutional conflict, and we're recommending that you not do that. So he didn't. He didn't do that. But Clinton did, and then Obama did in 2017 and expanded the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument. And so it really prompted this question that we tried to take all the way to Supreme Court, which is, who controls and makes the laws of our public lands? It's clear in the Constitution who does that. It's Congress. Congress does. And the Antiquities Act is really raising this question, even though there are more high-profile cases in our country on the Antiquities Act, whether that's Bears Ears or, there's been huge monuments that have been set aside in our oceans. The ONC Act and the Antiquities Act conflict, in our view, is just the clearest issue around presidential power and congressional power. And we were on the side of saying, Congress makes the laws, not the president.
And that's always been controversial for some reason. There's always a little gray area in litigation, and I think especially when that authority has been expanded beyond its original intent, it can get really controversial. And you brought up the specific example of the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, which has been especially controversial. So what are the practical impacts of that designation on timber management particularly?
Yeah, I mean, there are practical implications in terms of reducing timber supply from that exact land base. There are practical implications to the communities in terms of there are private landowners that have inholdings within that national monument, so they're implicated, the private landowners are. And then you just have issues around public access and what's allowed under, you know, the monument in terms of its management plan. But bigger than that is really this question, this legal question. I mean, I don't want to diminish the practical impacts of the monument because it's significant, but really it does tee up front and center this issue about whether or not a president can use the Antiquities Act to govern and manage our federal lands. Let me use a really extreme example, but it's important to kind of highlight why this is so important. The Antiquities Act doesn't quite have yet, as it's been adjudicated or not adjudicated in court, what the limits of the Antiquities Act are. So let me play that out. Let's say that a president of the United States in the future decided that they don't support logging in Western Oregon. They want to shut logging down. What would prevent a president from coming in and invoking the Antiquities Act and saying, I'm going to make all of the sea lands a national monument? These are antiquities, right? I mean, that if you go back and look at the Antiquities Act, what it was really about, it was giving the president power to take quick action to protect objects, mostly Native American indigenous artifacts, right? Congress wasn't able to act quickly enough and said, hey, President, we're going to give you this authority to protect these artifacts and objects. And then Congress can come in and actually use legislation to create larger protections as necessary and appropriate. And now, 100 years later, that's been used by a president to say, well, I can pretty much do whatever I want with the Antiquities Act. And so to use that extreme example is what prevents that? What prevents a president from coming in and saying, you know what, that entire national forest is a national monument. Yeah, you guys implemented this plan, you've been doing all these activities. Nah, not anymore. I'm going to use the Antiquities Act. Think about how dangerous that is, from my perspective, about the legal seesaw that could be going on back and forth that we're playing out right now. Instead of Congress coming in and saying, this is our job constitutionally, we make the laws, and here's what you're going to do. If a president can override Congress with the stroke of a pen, which is what happened on the ONC lands in the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, I'm not really sure what the boundaries are for a president to do what he or she wants on federal lands in the future.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the federal government has a really good way of slipping that in there, right? I mean, when you're talking about the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, you talk about even Chuckwalla, right? That's another controversial expansion. And now we're even seeing towards the future provisions in what they call HR1, right? That has touched on energy, infrastructure, permitting. Let's start with breaking that down of what is HR1 and how it's being used, and then what are the elements that meaningfully affect forest management?
Yeah, so HR1 has a couple of provisions that directly impact the forest products industry and our national lands. One is that HR1, for the first time in my recollection and the research that I've done, maybe first time ever, is it actually requires, it uses that word shall again, it requires annual increases of timber harvest off of Forest Service and BLM lands every year sequentially for 10 years. So that's a really important point. It codifies in law this increased trajectory of more timber volume coming from federal lands, and then it sends the revenues from that management that are generated on federal lands to the Treasury. Because HR1 was a budget bill, a reconciliation bill. It's about creating revenue or dealing with revenue. So that's how they included this provision in HR1 related to national forests, is saying we're going to require these increases and then we're going to use that money and send it back to the Treasury. That's one provision, and it's a really important provision because it actually, by the end of that 10-year period, if successfully implemented, it would get the Forest Service and the BLM closer to successfully implementing their current management plans. What do I mean by that? Well, if you actually nationally implemented, executed the requirements and the goals of all National Forest Service plans across the United States of America, we would be harvesting about 6.5 billion board feet per year on our entire country. 6.5 billion board feet, maybe a little bit more. Today, we do less than 3 billion board feet, right? So we're less than half of what's authorized in law to do. And HR1, its goal is to take an incremental annual increase approach to getting to full implementation of our forest plans. That's what HR1 does. So that's one provision. The other provision is a little bit more controversial, and I'll talk to you about that. That is a requirement in the bill that the Forest Service and the BLM execute long-term contracts. And that's another shall. It says the Forest Service, you shall do, in the case of H.R. 1, 40 20-year contracts across the country over the period of this bill. And the BLM, it's a smaller number for long-term contracts. Now, you might think just right off the bat, well, why would the timber industry be opposed or even care about these long-term contracts? In some cases, long-term contracts can be helpful, but 20-year contracts have sometimes can have practical on-the-ground impacts. Let me take a specific example, because some of this gets a little abstract, right? Let's say that you're in, again, my neighborhood. You're in Western Oregon, and you're on one of the most productive national forests on planet Earth, the Willamette National Forest, right? And they have a timber sale program. And in that timber sale program, they're putting out bids to a competitive industry. There are a number of mills here that want that wood and that want to buy that timber sale. Now, if that national forest starts saying, well, we have to do this 20-year contract, there's a risk, from our perspective, of putting all of that work in one contract for 20 years. And as you can imagine, when you have, let's say, 6 bidders or 6 mills that say, we could use that, and you're putting all of that work into a 20-year contract, that could have some anti-competitive impacts. So in other cases where you don't have milling infrastructure and you don't have a lot of opportunity, that 20-year contract might make a lot of sense, right? Because you're trying to attract financial interest, you're trying to attract capital investments, and you want certainty and predictability. So from that case, a 20-year contract might make a lot of sense. Why we, the forest products industry, engaged on that issue is because we were trying to explain to the policymakers what I just explained to you. There's consequences. Sometimes it can be the right tool, sometimes it's not the right tool. And if you're forcing the government to do this, make sure that you're in touch with your customers and your partners on the ground to make sure it's the right tool for the right problem.
Right, and permitting reform can be kind of a quick band-aid, but you gotta think about the long term. And now we're seeing another, I guess, I don't know if it's not even necessarily a band-aid, but another act that's being proposed that aims to streamline hazardous fuels reduction and restoration projects, which is the Fix Our Forests Acts. So what, if you can break that down for us, what problem is that trying to fix?
Yeah, I think it is trying to fix sort of the current paradigm, the current system, right? I mean, we've got, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, we have millions of acres are at risk. And right now, under the current paradigm of how we manage our lands, you have to go through very complex, expensive processes to do any work on the land base. You have to go through the National Environmental Policy Act. You have to consult under the Endangered Species Act. You have to go through a number of other laws, acronyms that I could call out, that make this very challenging and very expensive for the agencies. And then they have to go through litigation. In most cases, especially if they're going to do it at scale, they're going to get sued and they have to defend their projects in court. So the Fix Our Forests Act, FOFA, is trying to address that complex, expensive management paradigm that's not working by creating some efficiencies and tools for the agency. So I think from that perspective, it's really helpful to have a bipartisan, legislative vehicle, FOFA, out there that is trying to make progress on improvements to the process. But Noah, frankly, from our perspective, we need a completely different paradigm. You mentioned the word band-aids. That's exactly what I think is going on in a lot of cases for the last 20 years in this space. Is we've sort of accepted that the status quo is going to be our paradigm of how we manage forests forever. And if we just do these little tweaks, right? If we just give the Forest Service another categorical exclusion, or if we just give them a little bit more money, or if we fix fire borrowing, or if we do X, Y, and Z. I mean, I've heard every excuse under the sun for the last 20 years about why this doesn't work. Instead of thinking maybe the system itself isn't working. Maybe what we're trying to do is impose something that's not workable on the ground right now. I would argue that we have a 20th century, maybe even a 19th century approach to managing our federal land and resources when we need a 21st century approach to managing our federal resources. We need to rethink this. We need to rethink about how we're going to address our lands at scale. You can't do what we're currently doing and change the trajectory of our federal forests. I mentioned millions of acres. We're taking little bite sizes. The former chief called it at random acts of restoration. That's exactly what we're doing. Random acts of restoration. We're not zooming out and looking at the entire forest or watershed or sub-watershed and saying what's needed on this land base, what outcomes do we want now and into the future, and how do we design a management regime to do that at scale and to do it quickly. You know, just a really random fact for you that I think is actually informative though is, how long do you think it took to build the Empire State Building? In the 1930s, this is 1930, how long from beginning, breaking ground, to bringing a human being to the top floor? How long do you think that took?
Oh gosh, you're going to put me in the
I'll tell you,
spotlight
because
like
it's
this.
crazy.
Yeah.
It's
I'm not going to
13
embarrass
months.
myself. Yeah,
It's 13 months.
Wow.
13 months. 13 months. The federal government can't complete an environmental impact statement from beginning and end and then execute the work tied to that environmental analysis in 10 years. So to me, it's just, we have to be thinking about thinking bigger, thinking at scale. How do we go faster? I'm not talking about eroding our environmental laws that are well intended. But if we want to achieve the environmental outcomes that we want on federal lands, this current system doesn't match the need of what we want in terms of outcomes from our federal lands. It has to change, or our forests and our communities that depend on our forest are in deep trouble.
I could not have said it any better myself, but I can say we need to start thinking big picture. So between you and I, let's ask those important questions that are a little bit more big picture. What's the biggest misconception policymakers or the public have about the forest products industry?
Yeah, I really love this question. There's two I'm going to call out. One is I think it's that the people that work in the forest products industry, the mill workers, the loggers, the truck drivers, the whole supply chain that makes the industry work, that we don't care about our forests and the environment. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. And it really, as you can probably tell in my voice, it makes me angry. It makes me angry. The people that I represent, they love our public lands and forests. And why do you think that they do what they do? Because they've dedicated their lives to the hard work and the stewardship of our forests. They make something that literally, as we talked about, we all use every single day in our lives. They make wood products. If you have wood in your house or if you have wood in your building, that's frankly every single person. That was made possible by the forest products industry. We're the environmentalists. We're the conservationists. And it's what motivates me to do this job. And that's a misconception here. That's what's missing, is that working people are somehow like the enemy of our public lands. And I mentioned it. You don't get to just call yourself an environmentalist because you don't want to see a tree cut down. You know, as you consume wood products and they're being imported from other countries that don't share our environmental values and our labor values. So to me, that's one of the biggest issues that's going on, is somehow we're being viewed as the problem rather than the solution. We're part of the solution. And I own and admit that the history of our industry, we've learned, we've made changes, we've modernized. There have been mistakes that have made. I think the industry would own that and acknowledge that. What industry hasn't? That hasn't learned and adapted and changed. So are we. But we're a 21st century industry that cares about our public lands and want our public lands public. And we want to conserve them and steward them. And that also means, yeah, logging is one of the tools that we use to accomplish that. So that's one. The other one that I think is really important to call out is this myth that active management is a zero-sum game. You know, that's really frustrating to me. And when we think like that, it's really dangerous, right? Like if I get what I want, you don't get what you want. That's totally wrong. That's totally wrong on forestry. That's the beauty of forestry. That's the beauty of silviculture and managing our forests. If you look back for thousands of years, indigenous people manage these landscapes. Humans are part of the landscape. We're from them, we're going to return to them. And so this idea that somehow humans are separate from our forests and that if you manage them, if you log, that you're sacrificing wildlife, air, water, all these other things, is totally wrong. That is totally backwards. That's the wrong way to be thinking about it. It's the opposite. If we steward our lands, if we take care of our lands, they're going to deliver all the benefits that we all care about. It's not a zero-sum game. It's additive. Forestry is additive.
Chef's kiss on that one. I loved that answer, and And truthfully, it's a balancing act of supply demand, but I mean it's on both sides, it's going back and forth, and it's not blaming one or the other. Yeah, like you said, there's people use tables, people build houses, people, you know, even shoes. Like you think about the bottom of shoes, but there's a lot of different instances where wood and energy is prevalent, right? This is considered a sort of energy.
And just to double down on that, no, I think just to zoom out a little bit, sometimes I think what we forget about, and we started this conversation talking a little bit about my own background in international travel, right, and that exposure to other cultures and how we think about natural resources. I think there's this idea for some people, at least in my neighborhood where I live, on forest management, where they think that if they stop a forest management project, they think if they file a lawsuit and stop the Forest Service and BLM from doing a project, that they're saving, the forest, that they're doing something good for the environment. That, again, what a false notion about how this all works at a macro level. This is a global environment, right? So if you temporarily or permanently stop a timber project in Western Oregon or in Washington or Idaho, wherever it is on federal lands, this idea that like you're somehow also reducing demand for wood products? No, you're not. You're not at all. Demand for wood products globally is going up. So our choices, manage our resources under our laws with public processes and public engagement, some of the strongest environmental and labor laws on planet Earth. And if you don't want to do that, then we're going to bring it in from someplace else. Fact. And do you want it to come from South America? Do you want it to come from Southeast Asia? Do you think that that's better for the global environment? Do you think that's better for the American worker? Do you think that's better for the worker anywhere? That we're going to say, hey, we don't want to sustainably manage our federal lands in Oregon, so China, Russia, Southeast Asia, go ahead and send us your wood. We'll use that, and we're not going to use ours. Thank you very much. And cherry on top, we're going to call ourselves environmentalists. That's crazy to me. Like, that is not environmental at all. And that's why I call ourselves environmentalists, because we're thinking global. There is a demand. We can meet that demand. This is a renewable resource. We should do it responsibly, use active management, the best available science. Let's do it in our backyard and not export our values to other countries in this world. To me, that's true environmentalism, is thinking global, acting local. That's what we should be doing.
Makes it more expensive as well to import. And then when you live in these areas where a lot of these threats are imminent, it's sometimes it's not on a macro level. So let's talk about even maybe on a local level, like you said, like maybe even in your own neighborhood. What would you tell people who live in areas where there is a current real threat of, let's take, for example, wildfires, or people who feel frustrated by the lack of help they're getting from federal or even local governments? What would you tell them?
That we can do this together, that we can work together to figure this out, that we don't have to accept the status quo, that the current paradigm, just because it doesn't work now, is our inevitable future. That's, I think sometimes people in my industry maybe feel like we've been dealing with this for 30 years and we're not seeing a lot of progress. To not give up, to understand the history here, that things change, things come and go, and I'm excited about the future. We can change this. I fully admit and recognize we're up against some incredibly complex, controversial changes potentially in federal lands. It's also sort of in that chaos that you can develop new solutions and new paradigms. So for people who are interested in this space and want to engage in this space, now is the moment. I would say in the next couple of years, the decisions that will impact the trajectory of our public lands and the communities that surround them and are connected to them for the next 50 years will be decided in the next couple of years. That's how important this moment is, truly, because we are going to be talking about and prompting, are our federal laws working? Are our federal environmental laws working? Are they delivering the outcomes that we want? Do we need to reevaluate this relationship between our communities and our public lands and forests? What do we want from our public lands? Are they delivering it? Is the system that we have in place capable of matching the crises that we face? I think that those are the conversations and questions that are being prompted right now, and I'm excited to be a part of that solution, and our industry is excited to be a part of the solution.
Mic drop moment. Travis, Joseph, not only seeing the trees, but seeing the forest for the trees. And we appreciate your insight as well as you for joining us. So first off, just kind of feel free to tell us, the people, what you may be working on and how they can further support your fight in the fight for liberty.
Yeah, well, there's some huge issues going on right now in the Pacific Northwest and the West more generally that will impact the country. So one is that, as we mentioned, started with the Northwest Forest Plan. The Northwest Forest Plan is in a process to be amended, changed for the first time in 30 years. So I would encourage your listeners to be involved, and they can do that through our organization or through a partner organization, Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities, where they can learn more about the process, how to engage, how to weigh in. But it kind of gets back to this idea that we're at a crossroads. For the first time in my lifetime, the Northwest Forest Plan is being contemplated for significant change on these 24 million acres in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. That's a huge moment. This is our opportunity to make change, to modernize our approach. At the exact same time, those ONC lands that we talked about, that management plan is being revised by this administration. That's 2.5 million acres in Western Oregon. Same concept. You can engage in this process and support these efforts and be a part of the public process through AFRC or HFHC. Learn more. I just encourage people to be curious and ask questions. You know, there's so many headlines out there, especially in my part of the world, in the Pacific Northwest, as you can imagine, that are completely misleading or just outright lies about what's really going on in public lands. So my prompt would be, folks, be curious, be curious. This is a critical moment. We can change the status quo. That's up to us if we want to engage. Government goes to those who show up. Let's show up. And let's put ourselves on a better trajectory, both for our forests and communities. And there's current process, Northwest Forest Plan, ONCRMP, and then of course the roadless rule, which is also being reconsidered in terms of rescinding that rule and opening up public access and doing more responsible management of public lands. Those three issues alone are game changers on public lands, and they might set the table for further change down the road in other parts of the country.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Oh my gosh. President of the American Forestry Resource Council, Travis Joseph, here to educate the people, keeping the momentum up, opening up the can of worms, telling them how he really feels, and I love it. I love every bit of it. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe and follow Beyond the Bench wherever you get your podcasts, and visit mslegal.org as well as American Forestry Resource Council to learn more about how you can stand with us in defending the Constitution. My name is Noah Dieskau, joined by Travis Joseph, and we will see you next time to go Beyond the Bench.